Melisandre, one of the most enigmatic characters in Game of Thrones, embodies the psychology of religious fanaticism through her unwavering devotion to the Lord of Light. Her belief system is not merely spiritual, but deeply intertwined with her identity, purpose, and perception of reality. From a psychological perspective, fanaticism often emerges when an individual anchors their sense of meaning and control in an absolute ideology. For Melisandre, faith functions as a cognitive framework that organizes the chaos of the world into a narrative of prophecy, destiny, and divine intervention. This rigid belief structure allows her to interpret every event as confirmation of her faith, reinforcing her conviction that she is an instrument of a higher power. A defining feature of fanaticism is the phenomenon of cognitive closure, where individuals seek certainty and reject ambiguity. Melisandre consistently demonstrates this trait by interpreting visions in the flames as irrefutable truth rather than symbolic or uncertain guidance. Even when her predictions prove incorrect, she does not abandon her belief, but instead reinterprets the evidence to fit her existing worldview. Psychologically, this reflects confirmation bias, a process in which people selectively interpret information in ways that support their prior beliefs. Melisandre's visions serve less as objective revelations and more as psychological reinforcement of a worldview she cannot afford to question. Another psychological component of her fanaticism is the moral absolutism that accompanies strong ideological devotion. In Melisandre's mind, the struggle between the Lord of Light and the Great Other represents a cosmic battle between pure good and ultimate evil. This binary perception simplifies moral decision-making by removing ethical ambiguity. Actions that would otherwise be morally reprehensible, such as burning people alive, become justified sacrifices in service of a greater good. In psychological terms, this reflects the process of moral disengagement, where harmful acts are reframed as necessary or righteous within a larger ideological context. Melisandre's personal history also plays a crucial role in shaping her fanaticism. Although the series only briefly hints at her past as a slave, this background suggests a life marked by vulnerability and powerlessness. Individuals who experience profound suffering or lack of control often gravitate toward belief systems that promise meaning, structure, and empowerment. Through her faith, Melisandre transforms from a powerless victim into a chosen servant of a divine force. The psychological appeal of such transformation is immense, as it converts trauma into destiny. Her identity is inseparable from the role of prophet and guide. In many forms of fanaticism, belief systems provide individuals with a clear and elevated social identity. Melisandre does not simply believe in the Lord of Light. She sees herself as a vital intermediary between the divine and humanity. This role amplifies her commitment to the faith, because abandoning it would mean losing not only her beliefs, but also her sense of purpose and significance. The psychological cost of doubt becomes extremely high. Group dynamics also reinforce Melisandre's fanaticism. When she joins Stannis Baratheon's court, she finds a community willing to validate her beliefs and authority. Social reinforcement is a powerful psychological mechanism. When others treat a person as a prophet or spiritual authority, the individual is more likely to internalize that role completely. Each apparent miracle, whether real or perceived, strengthens both her influence and her conviction that her visions are divinely guided. Another important psychological factor is the seductive nature of perceived supernatural power. Melisandre performs acts that appear miraculous, such as giving birth to a shadow assassin or resurrecting Jon Snow. Whether interpreted as magic or divine intervention, these experiences likely deepen her belief in her own connection to the Lord of Light. Psychologically, when individuals believe they possess extraordinary abilities validated by real outcomes, their confidence in their ideological framework intensifies dramatically. Fear also plays a central role in the psychology of fanaticism, and Melisandre's worldview is built around an impending apocalyptic threat. The prophecy of the long night creates a sense of existential urgency that justifies extreme actions. In psychological terms, perceived existential threats often lead individuals to cling more tightly to ideological systems that promise survival or salvation. Melisandre's faith becomes not only a spiritual belief, but also a defense against cosmic annihilation. Her visions in the flames further illustrate the psychological interplay between perception and belief. Humans naturally search for patterns and meaning in ambiguous stimuli, a phenomenon known as apophenia. By staring into fire and interpreting shapes and movements as prophetic images, Melisandre transforms randomness into divine communication. This process strengthens her conviction because each vision feels deeply personal and revelatory. Ultimately, Melisandre's fanaticism emerges from a complex combination of psychological needs: the desire for certainty, the search for meaning after trauma, the reinforcement of social identity, and the interpretation of ambiguous experiences as divine signs. Her unwavering devotion is not merely blind faith, but a psychological system that sustains her sense of purpose and justifies her actions, even when those actions lead to tragic consequences. While Melisandre's fanaticism initially grants her confidence and authority, it also leads to devastating moral and psychological consequences. One of the most powerful examples is the sacrifice of Shireen Baratheon. In that moment, Melisandre's belief in prophecy overrides empathy and moral restraint. Psychologically, this reflects how ideological commitment can suppress natural emotional responses when individuals believe they are acting in service of a transcendent cause. The tragedy highlights the dangerous intersection between absolute belief and moral certainty. Fanaticism often operates through the mechanism of moral justification, where harmful actions are reframed as necessary sacrifices. Melisandre sincerely believes that Shireen's death will awaken divine power and ensure victory against darkness. This belief allows her to psychologically distance herself from the suffering she causes. In many extremist ideologies, individuals convince themselves that temporary cruelty is justified by the promise of ultimate salvation. However, fanaticism becomes psychologically fragile when reality contradicts prophecy. When Stannis' campaign collapses despite the sacrifice, Melisandre faces a profound cognitive crisis. The failure of her prediction threatens the very foundation of her belief system. For the first time, she cannot easily reinterpret events as confirmation of divine will. This moment illustrates the psychological tension that occurs when deeply held beliefs collide with undeniable evidence. The resulting crisis reveals an important aspect of fanatic psychology: the possibility of disillusionment. Melisandre briefly abandons her confident persona and returns to Castle Black in a state of visible despair. Her uncertainty reflects cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort that arises when beliefs and reality conflict. In this state, individuals must either rationalize the contradiction or fundamentally re-evaluate their worldview. The resurrection of Jon Snow becomes a turning point in her psychological journey. Initially uncertain whether the ritual will work, Melisandre performs it almost as a desperate act of faith rather than confident prophecy. When Jon returns to life, the event restores some of her belief, but also reshapes it. Instead of seeing herself as the central prophetic authority, she begins to interpret Jon as the true chosen figure. This shift suggests a subtle psychological transformation from absolute certainty to cautious humility. Another consequence of fanaticism is the isolation it creates. Melisandre's unwavering devotion often alienates her from others, particularly those who view her rituals and sacrifices as cruel or manipulative. Fanatics frequently struggle with social relationships because their worldview divides people into believers and unbelievers. In Melisandre's case, this dynamic reinforces her sense of being separate from ordinary human morality. Her character arc also explores the psychological burden of guilt. After Shireen's death and Stannis' defeat, Melisandre cannot fully escape the awareness that her certainty led to catastrophic consequences. Even though she continues to believe in the Lord of Light, the weight of her actions becomes part of her identity. Psychologically, this illustrates how fanaticism can leave lasting emotional scars when the consequences of belief become impossible to ignore. Over time, Melisandre begins to show signs of reflective awareness that were absent earlier in her journey. She admits that she has misinterpreted visions before, acknowledging that prophecy is not always clear or reliable. This shift marks a movement away from rigid fanaticism toward a more complex relationship with faith. Instead of claiming absolute knowledge, she accepts the possibility of error. Despite this emerging humility, Melisandre never fully abandons her belief. Instead, Her faith becomes more focused on the broader cosmic struggle rather than specific interpretations of prophecy. Psychologically, this represents a restructuring of belief rather than its collapse. The core ideology remains intact, but the certainty surrounding it becomes less rigid. In the end, Melisandre's role in the battle against the White Walkers and her quiet acceptance of death suggest a form of psychological closure. She fulfills what she perceives as her divine purpose, and then willingly lets her life end. Her story demonstrates both the power and the danger of fanatic belief. It can inspire courage and purpose, yet it can also justify terrible sacrifices and moral blindness. Through Melisandre, Game of Thrones presents a complex portrait of fanaticism, showing how deeply human needs for meaning, certainty, and redemption can shape both extraordinary devotion and tragic decisions.